Hello and welcome to the MS for Mama podcast. I'm your host, Abby Halberstadt, happy wife, mama to 10, Bible-believing Christian. And today's episode is for anyone who loves to learn and talk about birth. I have a certified birth doula on the podcast today to talk about a Christian approach to childbirth of any kind, whether it's hospital or home birth or birth center or whatever your heart desires and whatever the Lord orchestrates to work out for you. And I think it's going to be really informative and really helpful and interesting for you guys. Before I dive into that, I want to highlight our podcast sponsor, Voetberg Music Academy. You know, the Voetberg way is different than traditional lessons because they allow you access to your instructor 24/7, and you can choose your lessons and you can work at your own pace. And it is such a great way to stay engaged with music lessons in guitar, mandolin, ukulele, fiddle, or piano. You can also share lessons between siblings for as little as $30 a month when you use my code MSForMama20 for 20% off each month that you're enrolled. Not only can you take commuting to lessons off of your plate, but you can also have your students motivated to learn with physical badges that are mailed to their door as prizes for their achievements in their lessons, which kids absolutely love. Who doesn't like getting happy mail? So check out VoetbergMusicAcademy.com and use the code MSForMama20 at checkout to get 20% off each month you're enrolled. And I also want to mention Summit Ministries. I just have a little bit more time to tell you about them before their early bird discount disappears on March 31st. They do have a few in-person spots left for their summer apologetics camps, and you can grab them with the code MAMA26 for up to $500 off at summit.org/mama. We absolutely love Summit, and we think you will too. Hey friends, I have a wonderful resource for you on the show today. Dannette McGrew is a birth doula and childbirth educator who is here on the show to talk about all things childbirth, either conventional or crunchy and everywhere in between. And I love that her perspective is to honor God regardless of the circumstances of your birth and to bring it back to scripture, which is always the goal. Dannette, thanks for being on the show.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about how you came to be a birth doula and why this is something that you're passionate about.
Sure. So I grew up on a little farm community in a tiny little town. I had no idea that midwives still existed. I thought they were from the 1800s. And so when I, grew up and moved out of my little town, I met my husband at the time, and then we got married. And this was all on the West Coast. We ended up moving to Oklahoma shortly after we were married. And I got pregnant with my daughter just a couple years after COVID. And so I was kind of, I think a lot of us during that time started kind of just questioning the norms of medical care and like, hey, is this really the direction I want to go? And just, I think a lot of us kind of went down that path just of thinking twice before we just did the same thing that everybody else was doing. And personally, I had also come from a background working in EMS. And so I was an EMT for 5 years. Part of it was full-time and part of it was just on a volunteer department. And so I had a lot of experience in the medical world. And when I got pregnant, I was imagining myself giving birth in a hospital. And I was like, this is not my place of comfort. This is not where I would go to do something. And, in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm healthy. Why would I, hospitals are for sick people and hurt people. Why would I go there? And so I just started looking into, other alternatives and found this whole world of, midwives and doulas and natural birth. And I had no idea any of it existed. And so I had my first daughter in a freestanding birth center with midwives, and it was a great experience, but I felt like I was just like completely along for the ride. I was not in control at all. I was like, did not leave it feeling, empowered or like superwoman or any of that. I was just kind of just shocked by the whole thing. And then quickly got pregnant again. And with my second, I was like, man, I would like to do this a little bit differently. And I'm seeing all of these, the birth stories that you see online are extremely peaceful and, everybody's calm and in control. And it all looks like amazing, And I was just like, man, why didn't I have that? Why don't I feel like I've accomplished something amazing? Why aren't I proud of what I did? And so I really, in between my two pregnancies, I kind of wrestled with how to think about birth, and especially as a Christian, because, I was offered all of the hypnobirthing, even the Christian hypnobirthing, and a lot of it just felt uncomfortable for me as a Christian. I was like, I don't know if I should be doing that. And so In between there, I also encountered a biblical doula program. And I thought, this would be a great way for me to combine my experience with the medical world, because I love all things medicine, even though I don't practice as an EMT anymore. It's a passion of mine. I absolutely love the way that God designed the body. I love teaching people. So I thought, what a great way to combine kind of my, some things that I'm interested in. So with my second, I again didn't feel proud of myself. I was like, when does this happen where I feel like I'm empowered and accomplished and had this wonderful birth that I planned for? And it wasn't even that like things went poorly, everything on my birth plan or the way I wanted it to still, everything happened the way that I had wanted it to or planned, but I still didn't, I didn't get the feeling like this was great, And so I, just in thinking through like, what is the whole purpose behind this? What am I supposed to be feeling about this? Or how am I supposed to experience this? I started looking a lot more into a biblical view on birth. Because there's a lot of, Christian birth programs out there. And I even looked into a lot of those, and I saw a lot of them on my feed on Instagram, people claiming to be Christians and teaching, the promise of pain-free birth to all believers. Or, if you're a Christian, you just do the Christian hypnobirthing, and that's fine for Christians. And so there's just so many, it's like, it's not even like there's two ditches you can fall into. There's so many different ways you can fall off. And so it has taken me a lot of thinking to just try and bring this back to a biblical view on birth. And what does the Bible say about how we should do this, and what should our goals be, and, all of that. So I think the main thing that I see is that everything has become about the self. And even on the Christian side, like we've made birth about accomplishing our own birth goals, but using the Bible to get there, and we've completely forgotten that this isn't supposed to be about us at all, or about our accomplishing our own goals. It should be about faithfulness and holiness, right? Like God isn't interested in making our birth plan happen. He's interested in our hearts, So that's just been what I've been working on for the last couple of years.
I love that perspective. From my perspective, a lot of people ask me, because I've actually had a lot of home births. I always have to think through the numbers because of the twins. I think I've done 5 home births, 2 hospital births, and 1 birth center. My first was a hospital. I love that with your very first, you were like, listen, I already know this is not my preferred place to be. And we'll talk about that more later in terms of how you can have a God-honoring birth no matter where you end up delivering.
Yeah.
One is not holier than another by any stretch. But I found out very quickly in the recovery stage, because I was only in the hospital for like 5 or 6 hours before he was delivered. The rest of the time I labored at home. And it was like 2 full days of labor previous to that, where I was just contracting and contracting, but not progressing very quickly, which is kind of what my body likes to do. And it was really in the aftercare of being messed with a lot and not liking the bed that I was in, and just kind of wanting to go home and hold my baby and be with my husband and be left alone, which is totally my personality. That I was like, there might be a different way. So I find it so interesting, because I have a friend who has 12, has had all of hers in the hospital, loves the hospital because she's like, it's a mini vacation. They bring you food. They, take the baby for you if you need a nap. And I'm like, hypothetically, that sounds perfect. And I should want that. And I just don't prefer it. And that's because God has made all of us unique and with different personalities and different preferences that can still be honoring to him. But what I hear you saying is that sometimes some of our preferences aren't glorifying God. And I want to back up, and because I think you did a good job of pointing to the root of it, that it's self rather than honoring God. And that's always going to be a problem, regardless of the kind of method or path that you follow to get to self-glorification. It's always going to be the wide path that leads to destruction in some way, shape, or form. But you mentioned hypnobirthing specifically. And I get asked about this a lot on my social media, whether I feel like it's an appropriate thing for Christians to do. So maybe back up and break down what hypnobirthing is, at least in its basic form, and why you don't feel like Christians should be doing it.
Sure. And so I think this applies to a lot of, maybe alternative wellness things, that we get offered. So everything from, Reiki to acupuncture to chiropractors to homeopathy, like it all kind of fits in the same category, which is, there's a lot of these wellness practices that we really have to think about as Christians. And I do think there's a lot of personal conviction involved. And then there's some other ones that are very obviously ones that no Christian should be touching. So I think there's room for a lot of discussion and thought around this. Personally, from what I have researched into hypnobirthing, it seems like it is primarily a spiritual practice, and it does derive at least some of its power or some of its effectiveness from a spiritual source. And I don't believe that spiritual source is from God. And so the primary purpose of hypnobirthing, and if you listen to it, you can hear this in all of even the Christian hypnobirthing tracks. They're using scripture and they're saying things and words that are true. But what they're doing with their tone of voice and the way that they speak, that monotone, really flat voice, it's very slow words. All of that is designed to basically put your brain in a state of suggestibility. It's designed to take away your critical thinking, to kind of put you in it's like essentially to bore your brain to death until it shuts off.
Like a trance.
Exactly.
Is what you're saying.
Yes, it's a medically induced trance, and it's very effective, but that shouldn't be, the measure that we're using. And
so it's just to clarify, the point of the trance is to help you with pain. Is that the reason for it?
Yes. So the purpose is to put you in a state of suggestibility, and then you reframe the sensations that you're feeling so instead of pain, they talk about pressure or waves or surges. So they use different terminology, right. And it's essentially like mindset work, right? But again, you have to put your brain into a state of suggestibility so your brain is on board and believing these things. And so there's a whole slew of, things we could talk about with critical thinking and being Christians, and we should not allow others to be in that much control of our minds, and then,
right.
Yeah. So, and then there's a whole other element that I've also heard stories from people who have been really involved in this, and have experienced real spiritual attack and like demonic stuff. So there's a track coach. I can't remember. He was at a Christian university, or was it track, or I don't remember. He was a college coach, and he heard about the power of hypnosis for improving athletes' ability. And so he got his whole team on board with this, and the entire team was experiencing like nightmares, sleep paralysis, demonic dreams, all of this stuff. And he shut it down immediately and was like, there's something going on here. We need to stop this immediately. And so I've heard enough experiences from people like that who have said, this is not just a physical practice. There is spiritual elements here, and we should be really, really careful.
Okay. Yeah. So I had a little bit of contact with it. And interestingly enough, the main people that I know who were really into hypnobirthing have since, and I'm not saying this as a blanket statement, this has just been my personal observation that just came into my mind as you were saying that. The 2 or 3 people that I know that were very into hypnobirthing and this idea of kind of the way they were presenting it was like you were saying at the beginning, empowerment, kind of self-fulfillment, that the goal of the birth was to feel very, very as if you had, accomplished something in and of yourself, which again, backing up to what we were talking about before, the Bible's really clear that it's in our weakness that Christ is the strongest, that he is the one that's enough, that he is working his good pleasure and will through us. And I would say that includes in physical processes like childbirth. But the people that come to mind have since gone on to either reject Christian faith or become very progressive in their mindset, which is an interesting connection that I hadn't really thought of before we were talking. But, and it doesn't prove anything, because guarantee there's going to be somebody in the comments saying that's not been my lived experience. It hasn't done anything for me but help me. I have not turned away from the Lord. I wasn't in, but what you're talking to is the principle of that spiritual opening potentially to something that that you might not fully understand, is what it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think the principle behind it is if we're going to, as Christians, say that we're going to redeem any of these practices or be able to use these practices but separate them from the spiritual elements or whatever, we need to be very careful because sometimes non-Christian people stumble upon something that is true, but it's true because that's the way God made our bodies to work, or that's the way God made the world to work. But we just have to be really careful that if we're going to use something, it has to work solely based on the principles that God created and the way that God made the universe to work, and it cannot derive any of its power or effectiveness from a spiritual source other than God.
Yeah, that's well put. You also mentioned the idea of kind of claiming your believer's right to a pain-free birth, which sounds a lot like prosperity gospel to me. Would you associate those two?
It absolutely is, and I was really surprised that I mean surprised, but shouldn't be surprised, right? That a lot of the verses that people who teach pain-free birth, a lot of the verses that they use to prove what they're teaching are the exact same verses that prosperity gospel preachers are using when they're doing like the false faith healings. Um, the verses about like by his stripes we are healed, and they're twisting that out of context to saying that you can have physical healing right now as long as you claim it or as long as you have enough faith. And that is such a spiritually manipulative teaching. It's absolute antithetical to the gospel. And so these people,
Well, and it's antithetical to Genesis too. That's what I was looking up earlier. Anybody watching the video saw me get on my phone
yeah,
because I was looking up Genesis 3:16, which says, "To the woman he said, this is the consequence of Eve disobeying God in the garden. I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing," which means there was already going to be pain.
yes,
Pain didn't come about as a result of the fall. The pain was already going to be there. Pushing a human being out of our bodies was never going to be
yeah,
pain free, very likely. I know that there are one off experiences where it's essentially pain free, but but the idea is that, when our bodies stretch to allow these human beings to come into the world, that it is an uncomfortable process already. And then in the garden, Eve is essentially told that her pain in childbearing is going to be multiplied. In pain, you shall bring forth children. So if God says this is so, it's an interesting thing that we're doing to almost circumvent something that God has declared is a reality for the world that we currently live in, right?
yeah. And not only in Genesis do we see that, but a lot of people get bored reading through all of the prophets. But I highly recommend it because there are so many references to birth, and none of them look like what you see in Instagram, okay? None of them are wonderful, peaceful, pain-free descriptions of birth. And every time birth is used as a metaphor in the Bible, it's like a metaphor of judgment and something that comes upon his people quickly. They can't stop it. They can't do anything about it. The words are used like anguish and labor and toil and work and pain and this is like over and over again in the Bible. So I don't know, I don't really understand how you can get around the fact that there's going to be toil and pain sometimes and suffering sometimes and discomfort most of the time. Like this is the norm. We shouldn't have this standard. And like you said, there are some people who experience pain-free births. I'm not denying that. But that shouldn't be our goal, and that shouldn't be our expectation or the thing that we think that we deserve. Um,
Right. Yeah. And I was just thinking about, you were talking about the Old Testament and how, like, pains, that things are described as coming on people suddenly and being painful, and that metaphor is made for birth or for labor and then birth. And then I think about what Jesus says in John 16:21, when a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour has come. And we might think, well, wait a minute, why wouldn't we have joy because we finally get to meet this baby? But he's talking about the sorrow of having to go through the struggle
yeah,
of birth. And it says, but when she has delivered her baby, she no longer remembers the anguish. That's the word it uses, is anguish,
yeah,
for joy that a human being has been born into the world. And you were saying something just a second ago about how we do have to struggle. We have to go through hard things. And, I love the phrase, hard is not the same thing as bad. And I think birth is one of the best examples of this, that my goodness, just like Jesus says, you go through these contractions and transition and you've carried this baby in your womb for 9 months, and it's so hard sometimes. Having had 2 sets of twins, that second set of twins, my body was like, this is really rough. This
Yeah.
is genuine struggle and suffering sometimes. But the moment I had them in my arms, it was completely worth it. It was completely worth it before, but that rush of God-given emotion and endorphins is such a blessing. And quite honestly, I will say this, and then we'll get back into what we're talking about. I don't think I would appreciate holding a baby in my arms as much if I had not suffered some to get them there.
Yeah.
you know?
The difficulty that you get to get there, or the difficulty that you go through to get there, really makes the joy at the end all even sweeter.
Yeah. Yeah, it really does. So when you see kind of the direction that a lot of natural birthing sources are going toward, whether it's prosperity gospel-esque kind of lies where people are getting entrapped in this idea that they're owed a pain-free birth, or that they're owed prosperity if they just believe hard enough, or whether it's the idea of sliding, like you said, the other ditch of sliding into opening doors spiritually to something that you don't want to associate with. Do you feel like the natural birthing community in general that you've encountered is God glorifying? Or have you seen kind of some other aspects that are concerning to you?
Honestly, I've been really disappointed because even all of the Christian sources that I've found, almost all of them either incorporate some element of Ina May Gaskin's teaching. And I don't know if you're familiar with her, but just really quick, she was kind of a natural birthing guru from the 70s. But she had a completely secular worldview, devoid of God. She looked at the animals essentially and was like, none of the animals seem to have any difficulty or pain giving birth. So why should we? Like, what are we doing wrong? And so that was her standard, was we should be birthing just like the animals. But we know that we
Mm.
are created in the image of God. We're not just like the animals. And that shouldn't be our goal or our standard. And so um, most midwives, even the Christian ones, are pulling some sort of beliefs from Ina May Gaskin or other people that are teaching from a worldview that's completely devoid of God. Either that, or like you said, on the other side, they're pulling from sources like Jackie Mize that teaches supernatural, pain-free birth by faith and that kind of thing. And again, it all comes down to, like, are they teaching that the self is the source, that the self is the goal, that your own empowerment and fulfillment is the goal? Or are they looking and teaching you that God is the source and that, glorifying Him is the goal, being faithful is the goal? And there's a lot of different methods you can take to get that. But, this is kind of a critique I have of, like, wellness culture in general, because, it started out with such good intentions, which is that we want to steward our bodies and take care of them and, do that in the best way possible so that we can be there for our kids, so that we can do activities that will glorify God, so that we can create more fruit that's going to glorify God. But it's so easy to slip into the trap of, like, wellness just for wellness's sake, or, thinking that we deserve to have a completely healthy, pain-free existence here on earth. And that's just it's not what the Bible teaches. And it's setting ourselves up for a lifetime of disappointment.
Yeah, I think to clarify something, there are going to be some moms listening that want to honor God and they want to align with scripture. And they're listening to us and they're thinking, wait, okay, so I have an upcoming birth and I wasn't going to hypnobirth and I didn't think that I was owed a pain-free birth, but I was going to kind of do some of these things to make the experience more comfortable. Am I not supposed to do any of those things? I mean, you're a birth doula. I'm sure, have some interventions that you do for your clients to help make their experience more manageable. You were talking about with your first birth, you didn't feel like you were enjoying it at all. So do you feel like it's all or nothing? Because there's a version of this that could turn into birth asceticism,
Right.
where it's like,
Yeah.
let's make this the most extreme, stark, let's let's go find a hut in freezing temperatures to deliver in so that we're the
Yeah.
godliest, and I don't think you're saying that at all.
Yeah, not at all. Definitely. I love that you use the word asceticism, because that's exactly what it is. Like our own pain and suffering is not going to bring us any closer to God or make us any more holy. And I see this too a lot where it's like we've almost put physiological birth or natural birth, whatever you want to call it, we've almost put it on a pedestal that's like, this is the only way to glorify God. And it, but there's, again, that's asceticism. It's not what the Bible teaches. So like you said, I'm a birth doula. I have all the tips and tricks to make it as comfortable as possible to help you manage. And there are absolutely things you can do, like deep breathing exercises that's going to work with your nervous system. And that works because of the way God made the body. Again, it's not any mysticism or woo-woo. Like, that's how God designed your body, is for the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system to work interchangeably. And there's things you can do to, make that more comfortable and stay in control and that kind of thing. Again, I think it's more about your goals in it. So are you doing everything you can to escape pain? Are you doing everything you can to get out of the discomfort and run from it at every turn? Are you making all your decisions based on fear of what will happen or what might happen? Or are you saying, okay, this is going to be some hard work. Let's get the tools we need to do the work well, and to do it for the glory of God. And I think one of the real good questions that you can ask yourself is, how would I feel if none of it worked? Or how would I feel if everything goes the exact opposite of my birth plan? Will I feel as though I have failed? Will I feel despair, like I didn't get what I wanted? And that can be a real good clue as to where your ultimate hope is and where your ultimate satisfaction is. Because, if everything else gets taken away from you, if even your own body and your health is taken away from you, do you still have the Lord? And is that where your hope really lies?
Yeah, that is so good. I loved that you said we are gathering tools to tackle this with excellence or something similar to that. Because just like you said, yet another ditch is to go so far the direction of just accepting your fate that you don't avail yourself of opportunities to educate yourself and to equip yourself well. So I really liked that. But then the self check of like, am I going to be okay if this doesn't go like I want it to?
Yeah.
I actually experienced that twice. Both of the outcomes were great. And I am grateful for the experience both times. But one was with my number 8 when I was going to do another home birth. I'd already done 5, and he was going to be my number 6th home birth. And my body just wouldn't go into labor and stay in labor at home. I was having a lot of birth anxiety after my number 7 was born because it was probably my most difficult last 2 hours of labor to date. Lots of back labor, no space between the contractions, no kind of brain space to breathe and think, just pain for 2 hours. And lots of people can relate to that for every single one of their births. Mine tend to be very spread out. So even though it's exhausting, at least you have a lot of time to process the buildup. And so my body was kind of freaking out at having to do this again, even though I would, my brain would try to say, we're fine. And so I ended up giving birth in a birth center, not because that was the plan, but because every time I went home from an appointment or from an outing that I was doing to distract myself from the fact that I was not in labor 2 weeks after the 40-week mark, my body would just stop, or it would start having like shakes, and it was really not happy. So I am at a sonogram for them to check everything at 42 weeks and 3 days. And my midwife at one point, as I'm just kind of staring in a corner, mildly catatonic because I'm so tired and so discouraged, like I've done this so many times and it's still not working. What's going on? And she said, well, what if you just stayed here? And it was so interesting because it was not at all my quote birth plan. I didn't have anything written down. I was not strongly clinging to this concept, but I had just done home births and liked them. So I was just going to do it again. And it was amazing, the mindset shift, because I held that pretty loosely. I was like, oh, I can do that. Oh, that sounds hopeful. Not going home to a quiet house because my mom was being so nice to go come get all my kids. That sounds like a great idea.
Yeah.
I literally started contracting on the spot. And even though it was still another 13 hours before I had that baby, I didn't stop contracting, which felt like a miracle because I had done the stop start thing for so many weeks by that point. So that was one, quote, not going to plan. There was an absolute provision from the Lord. And then the second one was the next birth with my second set of twins. And I had to have them in a hospital unless I wanted to go find some midwife I had never used before, which I did not want to do, because my midwife was closing down her practice pretty soon. She wasn't doing multiples anymore. It was 2020. Weird stuff was going on. And so I did co-care between her and an OBGYN that she trusted, split the appointments, but I had to be in a hospital to deliver with the OBGYN. I was on an operating table in an operating room with glaring lights. And I remember as I went into the hospital the night before, feeling really low, just like, Lord, this is not what I want. This is like the opposite of what sounds like a good birth to me. This sounds like a ton of intervention and a ton of artificial poking and prodding. And I just want to have these babies and have them be healthy. And I had to basically work through that at like 3 a.m. with my husband asleep on the couch beside me and feeling very alone and very emotionally low and very, very physically exhausted by that point in the pregnancy. And I had to surrender any preferences I had and say, Lord, your will be done. And what ended up happening was that I had them the following day, like I said, on a table in an operating room. And when my first came out, he was a perfect little guy who's 5 pounds, 4 ounces. They put him on my chest. The doctor ended up maneuvering my second out and basically pulling him out of me because she was worried about the water breaking and the cord coming out. And he came out gray and floppy and not breathing. And they had to administer oxygen, and then they had to administer oxygen again. And he was fine after that. But I was like, Lord, you knew where he needed to be. You know, my midwife was there attending as well because they let her be there. And she said the first time that way they administered oxygen, we would have done that at home. The second time we would have called an ambulance and gotten an ambulance, and you would have ended up in a hospital anyway. So just being able to see exactly what you're saying, that as I surrendered my preferences and my hopes and dreams for this birth to the Lord and said, I may not like it, but you're sovereign and you're good. Man, did he show that to be true both times. And I guarantee you that we'll get some comments from moms who feel the same way.
I love that.
You mentioned to me when we were talking about having this conversation before we even started, that you wanted to be really clear that any kind of birth can be a God-honoring birth, because you're a birth doula, and I'm assuming, well, actually, I shouldn't assume. Where are most of your births happening?
So most of mine have actually been hospital births. And so that's just kind of the way it goes. A lot of times people who want a more natural birth but are hindered by, they don't have the finances to do a home birth or pay for midwives out of pocket. You know, if their insurance will only pay for a hospital birth, they're kind of stuck with that. And so a lot of that demographic of people also wants to hire a birth doula to, help facilitate their wishes during labor, that kind of thing. And so the majority of my clients have been hospital births. And I say in my experience, like, the provider actually matters more than your birth location. And the way the provider approaches, pregnancy, labor, interventions, all of that. And so I think it's more important that you have a provider who is on board with you and who is going to honor your wishes. And, if you don't, then definitely get your husband on board as your advocate, or get a doula, or get somebody who can help you speak up and do all that. But
so are you, as a doula, someone who literally can step in and say, no, she has this on her birth plan, and advocate for your clients that way?
I try not to, unless that's the only option. So just coming from a place of having worked in the medical industry before, I don't see myself as standing in between the parents and the medical industry at all. I don't want there to be a confrontational relationship ever. I think we're all on the same team. And so the majority of what I'm doing is educating the parents on all of their options, talking to them beforehand about here's the interventions you may be offered. Here's the way you can ask questions to give yourself more time to think about it, or, just making sure they're aware of all the pros and cons of what may be offered to them beforehand is really big. And then, in the moment, I also talk to them about hey, are you comfortable speaking up for yourself? And we can do some training on that. Here's phrases you can use. Here's the way you can do this. And if they're not, or if in the moment they're staring at me and what do I do at the moment? I usually try to say something like, hey, can they have a few minutes to think about it and discuss? Or, hey, you had mentioned that this is what you wanted. Do you still feel that way? Or do you want to change your mind? Or, So I try to just phrase things as questions and, just kind of take the pressure off of the moment. And so the parents can have that opportunity to speak up for themselves, because it's always better coming from the patient and the parents themselves.
Yeah, I agree. Are there any recommendations that you have for all the moms out there who might want a more holistic approach that you give as blanket recommendations? Maybe they aren't. Maybe it's all individualized, but is there anything that comes to mind that you're like, hey, if you want a more holistic approach, either at home or, like you say, specifically in a hospital, here's the kind of things you need to consider or ask for?
Yeah, I think it really just comes from talking to your provider a lot and bringing things up and saying, "Hey, what's your standard protocol for approaching this?" Or do a lot of open-ended questions and just allow them to talk, and you'll get a really good feel for how they approach things. And if they say things like, "All of my patients do this," or "I recommend this for everybody across the board," that kind of starts to that would at least be a yellow flag for me, because I think that care should be really individualized, and it should be based on giving the patient all of the information and then allowing them to decide what they want. So I think that's an important tool, is you can just ask a lot of open-ended questions and get to know your provider and how they approach interventions and standard care and all of that.
That's great. So you're talking about basically giving them the tools they need to have truly informed consent.
Exactly. Informed consent is, a lot of people think it's just the paper that you sign when you arrive at the hospital, and it's not. To have true informed consent, you have to be aware of all of the pros and cons of what you're being offered, and there has to be the option to say no. If there's no option to say no, it's not informed consent, it's coercion, which is not legal. And so if your provider is not allowing you to say no to something, you can stand your ground. You can ask for, and even if you're by yourself and you don't have a doula or an advocate present, you can ask for the patient advocate at the hospital, or ask for the charge nurse and get another opinion, get another set of ears in there. So you just have to, it really comes from a place of understanding that God gave this child to you to be the parent and the steward of. So as Christians, we can't just do whatever we're told and say, well, they're in charge. Like, no, we're answerable to God for the care of our children. And so we have to take that really seriously, and not out of a place of fear, but just like, be curious, ask questions, ask, is this really the best thing for me? And if it's not, then don't do it. Just, use your critical thinking, use the best of your ability to care for the child that God has given you.
That's such good advice. And I love that you're encouraging parents to advocate for themselves, but it's less about self-empowerment and more about finding the tools necessary to do this in the most God-honoring way. And one of the ways that we honor God is by being informed so that we can take good care of the bodies that He's given us. And I love that you said it was for your children too. When those births become so focused on the mom, sometimes the experience of the child is completely ignored. But if the goal is to honor God, then we're going back to love God and love our neighbors. Literally, our closest neighbor while we're pregnant is the one inside our womb.
Yeah.
And having care and consideration for how our decisions are going to affect them is huge. I mean, that is absolutely the responsibility of the Christian parent. Well, Dannette, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and talk to us about this topic. I mean, I'm mostly followed by moms. A whole lot of them are young and in the childbearing age. And I think this is going to really help a lot of them to tune out some of the noise of culture and at least ask questions and start to maybe examine closely, like you said, with critical thinking skills, some things that they might have been told are completely normal or acceptable or no big deal. And the good news is that James is very clear that when we ask God for wisdom, He gives it freely and without reproach. And that would apply to birth and delivery as well. Is there anything you want our audience to know about you, and anything you want to leave us with?
Sure. I would just say, like, as a last thing, there's really so much more freedom than we think there is within the birth world and birth choices that are going to be honoring to God. And so don't get pigeonholed into, what's the societal norms, or what is the crunchy world telling me, or what does this person say I have to do? Like, you have to be steeped in scripture, and you have to understand the principles that are biblical. And within those principles, there's such a wide range of methods that you can use to have a baby and to glorify God while doing it. So we just need to remember that there's so much more freedom in Christ sometimes than we think about. So let's be really, hold tight to the essentials, and then hold everything else with a really loose hand.
I love that. That's great. That's great advice for lots of areas of the Christian life, not just birth. Dannette, thank you for coming on, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
If you enjoyed the MS for Mama podcast, I would be so honored if you would subscribe and follow along, maybe share with friends, or even leave a review. And if you want more content on motherhood and biblical responses to cultural issues, be sure to follow along on Instagram at m.is.for.mama.